Shlita, who has an illustrious career as a Rosh Yeshiva, Rosh Kollel, Magid Shir, and teacher of Torah Mamish all over, with a lot of a Masorah, so Talmud of Soloveitchik and other great Rabbanim. And unfortunately, the one unfortunate thing is I asked him to give the shir too late for him to be able to really bring his full, his full everything to the Sugya with all the other shirim that he gives. But I have no doubt that it's still going to be me'alu me'aver to anything we could imagine. So without further ado,
thank you so much. And shalom aleichem to everyone.
Shalom aleichem.
I was asked to give a shir about Kol Kavuah Kemechtal Mechtzedami and called the Parish Meruba Parish. This is a sugya I learned many years ago. I'm sure you gentlemen are much more into it after hearing some of the rabbis' shir before about Dover Hatichriyus Kabin, Einariyus Kabin, and so forth. But we'll give it a shot. And if it's Chazorah, I think Chazorah is always a good thing. Am I right? Okay. So where do we begin in this massive, massive sugya that's all over Shas? Let's begin, perhaps, with the Gemara in Ksubis on Daf Tesvav. And the Gemara says the following. Amar Abzera, Kol Kavuah Kemechtzal Mechtzedam. Okay, now Rabbi Zera is the Amora who begins with this breakthrough that although the Torah says Achrei Ravim Lahatos, and we should rely on Rov, nevertheless, if it's Kavuah, it's not a Rov, but rather Kemechza al Mechtzedam. In a sense,
sorry, what is the topic, Rov?
Kol Kavuah Kemechza al Mechtzedam in Rov. And in a sense, you could say that, oh, by the way, Nasan,
yes,
I can't take questions today. I apologize to you. Okay. So you have here a conflict between two principles. On the one hand, Rov, and on the other hand, Kavuah. So Kavuah tells you it's Mechzal Mechz, and Rov tells you that called the Parish Meruba Parsha came from the Rov. So Abzera says that the overpowering rule here is going to be Kol Kavuah Kemechzal Mechzedam. And later on, we're going to discuss the following issue. Is there Rov, or does Kavuah completely undermine the Rov? Do we say that in a case of Kavuah, there is no Rov? The Kavuah is Mevatel the Rov. All you have is Kemechzal Mechzedami, or do we say no? There is a Rov, but on a temporary basis, what you might call a blockage. What's monea? What prevents the Rov from being relied upon, and that is Kavuah. But the Rov is still there. It still operates. Okay, leave that for now, but keep it in the back of your mind. So the Gemara explains the following, that if you have, for example, a situation in which a woman was raped outside the city, and the question is, who is the Boel? Is the Boel a posel, makes her into a zona, let's say it's an Evid or Akum, or is it Yisrael kosher? We don't know. But the assumption is that the Boel came from the nearby city, and the Gemara says, according to Reb Zera, we make the following distinction. In a case where Rov ha'ir are ksherim, and therefore we should apply the principle of Rov and assume that the Boel who came out of the city came from the Rov, and therefore she remains Kshera L'Kahuna. Says Rabbi Zera, it depends. If we know that the Boel came outside of the city, in other words, he was Porish, so we want to identify the Boel, and the city is Rov Yisrael, then we establish that she is Kshera L'Kahuna, because we assume that the Boel was kosher L'Kahuna, he didn't passel her as a zona. That's because the Irua took place outside the city. If, on the other hand, She entered into the city. Okay, I'll use a phrase that dates back to before you were born, but Avon calling. In other words, she knocked on one of the doors and she was selling whatever she was selling. And then something happened inside the house. Then says Rabbi Zera, even though it's Ir Sharuba Yisrael Ksherim, she's Psula Lakuna because Kol Kavuah Kemechtal Mechtzidon. And the Gemara makes the following distinction. There's something called Naidi and something called Makom Kvius. If the suffix took place in a Makom Kvius, then we apply the principle of Kemechtal Mechtzidon. If, on the other hand, the suffix took place in Naidi, in some place that's moving, that's not stationary. Again, we have to define all these terms very precisely, but just in a general sense, then we apply the principle of Kol de Parish Miruba Parish. The Gemara goes on to give another case, another scenario in which Rabbi Zera's principle may or may not apply, depending upon whether it was Nayid or it was Kavuah. And that's going to be the case of Teisha Chanuyos, right? So you have 10 butcher shops in the city, and let's say 9 of which, it could go either way, L'Kul, L'Chumra, but let's take the case of L'Chumra. 9 out of the 10 are selling Basar Kosher. 1 out of the 10 is selling Basar Treif. And now you have a piece of meat, and you have a suffix on the piece of meat. So Gemara says the following. If you found the meat outside, let's call it in the shuk, outside of the shuk, right? And it was Poresh, then we apply the principle of Kol de Parish Meruba Parish, and it's mutter. If, on the other hand, the suffix was nolad, it emerged in a Makom Kavuah inside the Chanuyos. I don't know if it was inside one of the Chanuyos or somewhere in the vicinity of the Chanuyos, surrounded by these stores, by these butcher shops, then the suffix is nolad b'makom kvius. And these cases in the Gemara remind us of a different sugya, which you're all familiar with if you learn Psachim on Daf Tes, the sugya of B'dikas Chametz. You made a B'dik in the house, the Chazaka is now, it's a Cheskas Baduk, but then you see some little creature, an Achbar, that goes into the house with Chametz in his mouth. Okay, then? So it depends. If you saw the Achbar going in and the suffix would be nolad in a makom prisha, then you could apply kol de parish. But if, let's say, the suffix was only nolad after the achbar went into one of the houses, and now you want to determine which house it went into, then we apply kol kavuah. So Rabbosai, what would be the halach in the following case? If I don't know which butcher shop I went into, did I go into a butcher shop that sells non-kosher meat, or did I go into a butcher shop that sells kosher meat? So there the suffix is nolad in the nature of the butcher shop, where you categorize it. That would be a nolad b'makom kvius, and then we would apply what principle? Kemechtal mechtzidon. But if, on the other hand, I come home and I bang myself in the head and I say, well, where did I buy this from? Did I buy this from the kosher butcher shop or the non-kosher butcher shop? Then I could say that this hefta, this piece of meat, is where the suffix is chal, and that's in parish. It's already outside the makom kvius, and I apply the principle of rov. However, we have another sugya in Nazir. And the reason why this sugya in Nazir on Daf Yud Beis is so critical is because of Tosas' kasha, his answer, and the Ramban's disagreement with Tosas. And that's going to really break new ground on this whole sugya of Kavuah. Yeah, please.
If you buy a piece of meat and you don't know which store you bought it from, you only realize that you bought it from an anonymous store in your home,
Well, I would say the following. I'm living now in a place called Efrat. Have you heard of it? In Efrat, if you don't own a dog, then you're in the mute. So my father said I could ask for anything for the Afikomen except for a dog. So that's what my brought. So I'm a little bit, an Am Necher over there in Efrat. But let's say I own a dog, theoretically. Now, I might be buying from a kosher butcher shop in order to feed my family, correct? I might be buying for my dog. If I'm buying for my dog, I can get a cheaper price where, I mean, this is a sugya in the Gemara about Russia, Posiliadis, whether he's Lahachis or Luteavon. So the Gemara there points out that Basa Nevela is a lot cheaper than Basa Shchuta. Is that true? Now, again, exactly which shchita you're going to rely on, I don't know. But if you have very particular, you insist on a certain kind of a shchita, then it's going to cost you money. You're going to have to pay for it. So I don't remember, did I buy for my dog? And sometimes you can tell in the packaging, but let's say you can't tell in the packaging. It's out of the package. So what do you do in that case? So if the suffix was already nolad, when I walked out of the butcher shop and I said to myself, which butcher shop did I go into? Was I buying for my dog or for myself? Did I buy basa nevela, basa kosher? That would be called kavuah. But if I get home, or for example, if I find a piece of meat and I don't know that the person who dropped the piece of meat went to buy for his dog or went to buy for himself, his family, that would be called the parsh movement.
Why is it different if you go home and you're outside?
Because once you get home, the question is whether that becomes a mokum kvius. In other words, at what point in time, here we get into the issue of yedias hasafik, which you spoke about earlier today, right? So if it was nodalo, after he walked out of the butcher shop, then at that point, if it's nodalo, the suffix is chal in a mokum kvius. Which butcher shop did I go into? If, on the other hand, I find out the suffix after it's already porish, so it was nayid, it was in a moving state, then I have a right to ask, where did the meat come from? And if I'm asking, where did the meat come from, then I have a right to apply the principle of kol d'par. So let's hold on to it for now, and we'll try to... I want to present to you the sugya in Nazi, because here we get into the real issues. And my goal today is to touch on a number of different issues in the Rishonim, the Poskim, and hopefully to get to the Ma'aseh Vilna with regard to Kol Kavuah. The Gemara says in Nazir the following: a man appoints a shliach to be Makadosh an Isha on his behalf. There's only one problem. What did he fail to tell the shliach? Who should he be Makadosh for? In fact, he basically said to the shliach, carte blanche, find any agreeable young lady and go ahead and be Makadosh for. Not the smartest thing in the world to do, as we'll soon see in the Gemara. And the Gemara says the following: okay, we're not 100% sure that the shliach actually was Makadosh an Isha, but the Gemara activates a principle, a chazaka, which is called chazaka shliach osa shlichuso, and therefore the premise is that the shliach went ahead and he was Makadosh an Isha, but who was he Makadosh? And this question has a twofold repercussion. Number one, the Mashaleach could no longer marry any of her close relatives. He can't marry her sister because she's an erva. And number two, anyone who wants to be Makadosh a woman, well, guess what? Maybe you'll be Makadosh the woman that the Shliach was Makadosh on behalf of the Mashaleach. We'll see if she herself is believed. But in any event, then you're involved in an Eishes Ish. But let's just focus for a moment on the question of the Mishaleach. He's got to know whether or not a woman that he wants to marry is the sister of his wife, because he doesn't know who his wife is. So the Gemara says, well, why not ask the Shliach? And even though we have a principle called Ein Dover Shebe'erva Pox Mishnayim, but this is a different case because of a principle called Biyada, which I'm sure you've discussed in the past. Be that as it may, the Gemara assumes that the Shliach would be believed to say that he was Makadosh this woman and not that woman, etc., etc. But the problem is, as we say in Yiddish, Erz Gestorben. The Shliach died. So we can't ask the Shliach. So the Gemara says the following, that in such a case, the Gemara says, Asur lechol hanoshim sheba'olam. My heart goes out for him. Can't marry a single woman. Why? Shemehi krovasol shel mekudeshes. Maybe she is the sister of his mekudeshes. And now the Rishonim are going to talk about a case where she has no, you meet a girl that has no sisters, or she can claim that she knows that her sister was not Makabel Kedushin, which if you believe, does Eid Echad have the power to be believed, even not for herself, but to testify about someone else, and so forth and so on. Now the Gemara asks the following. The Gemara says, why don't we go basaro? If the man wants to marry a woman, what are the chances statistically that he's marrying the sister of his wife? Very low. Is that correct? So the Gemara says, let's assume, based on Rov, that she's not an Araba. She's not the sister of his wife. So the Gemara says, it depends. Ka'amina ana isha delo naida. What we were talking about here was a woman who's not in a state of naida, right? But rather, she's in a state of makom kavuah. And therefore, the Gemara says the following, that what about if you find her in the shuk, right? Like a question that we asked before, and the Gemara says, therefore she was naidi, and now you want to know, is she the sister of your wife? So the Gemara says, Hasam ahadra linichusa kamay. Another principle in Kavuah, that even if you find the suffix outside of the Makom Kfiyus, he didn't go in to marry this woman into our house, but rather he finds her in the shuk, and now he wants to know, did she come from the Rov who are not Arayos, or did she come from that one little select group of Miut? So you would say that now he found her outside the Makom Kfiyus, outside of a situation of Kavuah, but rather in a case of Naidi, and the Gemara says no. Even if he found her outside, she has a gravitational pull to return to where? To her bites, right? She's on her way back home. And if that be the case, she's considered Kavuah, and we're going to have a gigantic machlokas Rishona, whether that's a Dorais halacha or a Dorabanan halacha, fine, etc. But now the Gemara says that even though he found her outside the Kviyas, he can't rely on Rov because Ahadri L'Nichusa Kamais. Okay. Now we get to the machlokas between Tosfos and the Rambam. Now, we have presented this sugya so far according to one school of thought in the Rishonim. And that school of thought maintains in the Gemara Nazir that the issue of Naidi or Kavuah depends upon the woman that he's coming to be Makadish. Right? Let's say he wants to be Makadish Leah, and now we have to determine whether Leah's status is called a Parish Meruba Parish, or alternatively, it's called Kavuah Kemechtal Mechtzedon. And the Gemara says it depends where you found her and so forth, but maybe even if you found her outside, is Hadril and Ichusa Kamais, etc., etc. Does that make sense so far? Isn't it intuitively correct that if you want to determine whether something is Kavuah or Parish, then you should be focusing on the issue at hand. What's the issue at hand, Barbosa? He wants to marry a woman. Well, what's her status? Is she Parish or is she Kavuah? Makes sense, no? However, there's a whole school of Rishonim who say no. You want to determine whether you have a case of Kavuah or a case of Parish. We're not going to determine that based on where she is, the woman that he wants to marry, the woman who is now the issue and the shaila that we're asking. And as soon as I hear the word shaila, I think of Tuma Vitara. You know, for example, in Safik Tum B'Shus HaYachid, it depends who you ask and how you ask. You know, yesh lo das lishol or not. But in any event, the intuitive sense, the way that I present here, is that we come in front of the rabbi and we say, look, we want to get married. Well, is she an erva? Well, is she parish or is she kavuah? However, many of the mefarshim in Nazir say differently. And maybe we'll get into some of them specifically later. And they say no. The question of parish or or Kavuah is about his wife. We don't know where she is. We don't know if she's in a house or she's outside in the street. And she is going to generate an Eser on her krovos, meaning on her sister, for example. And now we're going to say, well, she belongs to the rove, meaning that she is not the woman that we're talking about. But the issue about Kavuah and Parish will depend on her status, where she is. I'd like to suggest that this fundamental machlokes, before we get again to Tosa and the Ramban, might depend upon the following question. How do you determine Kavuah and Parish? One way is to say that it depends on the Safek Gufa, on the Gufa shall suffer. And when the Safek comes in front of us and we have to determine the status, like the case of Chatichas Basar, or for example, the case of the woman, we want to know if she's Ksheira Lakuna or not, we should focus all our energy on the Safek. And what is the Safek? The Safek is whether she is an Erev or not. Is she the sister of his wife? I would like to call that objective. What do I mean by objective? We're looking at the Safek as presented to the Rav, to the Halacha, to the Chacham, to whoever has the Paskin. So if we're focused totally on the objective Safek, then we ask ourselves, well, when did the Safek come to our attention? And on what person in this case, or perhaps even on what Hefta, is the Safek revolver? But we could take a different approach. And we could say, well, let's go back not to the Safek objectively, but rather to the subjective question that he's asking himself. And here we go back to the Leidas HaSafek. What do I mean, the Leidas HaSafek? I'm going to use a term which you might like or not like, but I'm going to borrow it from other areas of halacha. There's something called an oser. There's something called a posel. So I'm going to add another word here. I hope it's right. I'll be digduk. A misapik. I don't mean a misapik in the sense of a supplier, right? I'm talking about a misapik, mean who and what generates the suffix. Because what he's going to ask himself when he wants to get married is, well, who was the woman that was married by the shliach? So again, that's not the question that we're immediately answering now. What really is facing us is the issue of, can I marry this woman or not? But where does that suffix germinate from? If I go back to the original suffix, it's not in this woman, it's in the case of the Maisa Shliach. You follow me? Whom did the Shliach marry off on behalf of the Mshaleach? So therefore, if I'm going to take it from the perspective of the Mesapek, of the one who generated the suffix, then we want to go back to the original woman who was Mekudeshes, she accepted Kiddush. Okay. Tosis asks the following question. Yeah, please.
Yeah, can you repeat the previous point about where the suffix being generated is?
The suffix really begins, whom did the shliach marry? Then as a spin-off, as a repercussion, what we call a totza'ah, now we have to ask if this woman that he wants to marry is the sister of the woman that the shliach was mekadesh. But the yisoda suffix, and this is what bothers the, what he's asking for himself is like, who is the woman that I married? As a result, he has to ask, can I marry this woman? Is that clear? I tried to explain it in my terms. It's just my own terminology.
The original suffix are the original suffix was created by the original woman. He's
correct.
Married.
To whom he's married, we don't know.
Yeah, that's like a latent reality which only generates an actual halakha nafkamina later on.
Correct.
The question is, do we look at the suffix being generated all the way back at T1, or do we look at it when it's only becoming practical?
Correct.
That's
Excellent. But instead of the word latent, in my terminology, I'm using the word subjective. What do I mean by subjective? If you ask me what moves him in terms of, hey, what went on over here so I can know how to live my life, what's going to bother his mind is what you call the latent suffix. In other words, the original suffix that was generated by the woman, anonymous, faceless woman, we don't know who she is, that received the Kiddush.
For those who essentially want to be about the original. It's the question that we're going to ask, what's she about Kavuah Parish? So when we're going to ask, was she the Machmir at the time of the Kiddushin?
Correct.
Okay.
Right. No, now he wants to Makadosh Leah. Where is Rachel, her sister? Again, we don't know who Rachel is.
Where was she at?
No, where is she now? In other words, now I want to determine whether it's Parish or Kavuah. But what I'm going to ask is now at this moment, where is she? Because that's the question I want to know. I want to know who is she, and as a result, in order to determine who is she, I have to ask myself Parish and Kavuah. What is Tosfos ask? Tosfos asks the following question. He says, "You're telling me that the Meshaleach cannot marry any woman in the world. Im Kain," he says, if that be the case, just 1 second. Just give me 1 second, sorry. Okay, so I'll just mention, but this is not the part that I'm focused on right now. He says, can't all the women come forward who are not related, or they know that they're not related to the woman who received Kiddushin? Wouldn't that be enough to be matter? Okay, fine. Then he goes into a whole discussion, Tosfos, about would she be believed to say her sister was a Mekadesh? Just 1 second, but that's not the one. Oh, here it is. I think I got it. Yeah, the reason I made a mistake here is because Tosfos is not in Nazir. Tosfos is in another sugya called Kavuah, which is in Masechta Gittin. Adaf Samach Daled, if you want to make a note of it. Tosfos says the following. Why is it that the Meshaleach is Asur b'chol hanoshim sheba olam? Kol ha'olam ye asru lisa noshim mikach eshesish, safek eshesish. Correct? Tosfos says that logically, no one's going to be able to marry anybody. Because any woman you want to marry is a safek eshesish. So Tosfos suggests that suffix we could clarify. That she's not an Ashes Ish, because we assume she would not accept Kiddushin, not knowing that the Makadesh knows who she is. But then he goes on to ask a question about a Ketana. Let's say in a case of a Ketana, the father is Makabel Kiddushin for a Ketana. And in such a case, if we can't get the testimony from the father, and he doesn't know, I'm saying he's not available for questioning, let's say, and we can't ask the Ketana because she didn't accept the Kiddushin. Who accepted the Kiddushin? It was her father on her behalf. And if that be the case, then once again, we should say that no one can marry anybody, because maybe the father was Makabel Kiddushin from the Shliach on behalf of his daughter, who's a Ketana, or maybe even a Nara. I mean, Nara is a little more complicated, been a Rebbe Savia. But in such a case, she may have grown older, and through the years, we don't know where is this Ketana whose father accepted Kiddushin from the Shliach. So at this point, Tosfos says the following. This is a major breakthrough. Tosfos says that Me'ikar Adin, according to the strict letter of the law, just to translate it literally, Mutalo Lisa Kol Nashim Sheba'olam. Why? Ki rov Nashim Enom Krovos Leishta. Right? So most women in the world are not related to the woman that the Shliach was Makadesh. And therefore, Anu Holchim Basaruva. We should go Basarov. And then he says, so why does the Gemara establish that he can't marry anyone based on Kol Kavuah Kemechtzal Mechzadomi? Says Tosfos that Kol Kavuah Kemechtzal Mechzadomi doesn't apply here in this case. And why is that? Because Lo Amrinan Kavuah Kemechtzal Mechza, everyone can finish the sentence, you know it better than I do. Ella Imkain Ha-Isur Nikar Bimkomo. The precondition for Kol Kavuah is that the Isur is Nikar. Like, for example, you have 9 Chanuyos and 1 Chanus that's selling Basa Treif. I can point to that Chanus, and that's it. I know that is awesome. So the Isur is Nikar Bimkoma. Vaheter Nikar Liatzma. But now, where is this woman? Again, it depends which woman you're talking about. But either way, the woman herself is in a tarovis. She's mixed up with other women, right? The Eino Nikar, and we can't identify where is the erva. So it's not like a situation where a man might have had a relationship with an erva. We don't even know where the erva is. It's completely unknown to us. There's no Nikar Bimkoma. And therefore, Me'ikar Adin Ein Omer Bazeh Kol Kavuah Kemechtzal Mechzadon. And here's where the Ramban is going to disagree. The Ramban is going to hold that this is Me'ikar Adin, that Kol Kavuah Kemechtzal Mechzadami is Me'ikar Adin. And why? Says the Ramban, Ki Yadua, because there is no bittul. Because an Adam ain't no bater. So let's just summarize here. We have a fundamental machlokus here between Tosfos and the Ramban. And again, the Rishonim will line up on both sides of the fence. According to Tosfos, the precondition for Kol Kavuah is Ha'isar Nikar Bimkomo. And Tosfos repeats this over and over again throughout Shas, in Zvakim and in Gittin and in other sugis. So it means that you want to use Kol Kavuah to undermine a rov. The Torah says rely on rov. And now you're going to impose Kavuah, and you're going to say that Kavuah, in a sense, blocks rov. It terminates the rov. But we're going to say that it's not Kavuah unless it's Ha'isar Nikar Liatzmo, Nikar Bimkomo. If it's not Nikar Bimkomo, then we don't say Kol Kavuah. If we don't say Kol Kavuah, we go back to what? To Achri Rab Lahatos, we rely on rov. The Ramban says something else. No. We don't need nikar b'mkomo. Whether or not this kavuah depends upon whether you have bittul b'taroves. If you don't have bittul b'taroves, then it becomes kavuah, whether it's nikar or not nikar. So according to the Ramban, whenever there's something to be mafkia, like for example, we could talk about a chaticha rilis kabin and other situations that remove rov, or for example, an adam is eno batel b'rov, a birya, and so forth and so on, then we're going to say that it's called kavuah kemech tzal mechzadami. In other words, the Ramban sees it in the opposite direction. According to the Ramban, we start with kavuah, and kavuah prevents bittul from chal, and we knock off the bittul. We say kol kavuah kemech tzal mechzadami. But the opposite of kavuah is going to be bittul. So it doesn't depend upon whether nikar or isur. You can have situations in which you have eno nikar le'isur, right? Eno nikar isur b'mkomo. But you can ask yourself a different question: is there bittul? Is there not bittul? And that's the sheet of the Ramban. I want to just read to you a few lines from this sefer. I don't know if you've seen it. This is shiurim for my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik on Deah. And he writes here the following. He says, Lo Ramban begin daf samach dalid, lo azruinen bosa ruba, b'chai gavna, in the case of the shliach, v'af min haTorah asur lo lisa kol anoshim sheba'olam. And he quotes the Chavas Das, right? Rabbi Yaakov Lisa and Siman Kuf Yud Sifkat and Gimel and Vashtet and Chavas Das. The Ramban sover the ein adam batel berov afilu min haTorah. Umemela, if there's no bitul berov, shuv lo azlin and basaruba, and even though rov nashim are not arayos, right? And lamrin and kol kavua kemechzal mechzedom. He says, "V'nira shebazen nechluku tosfis v'Ramban tili olam af tosfis modim shebnei adam eina b'telim b'rov." Tosfos never questioned the premise of the Ramban. On adam is not batel b'rov. Elish esfirale, but Tosfos holds the chol shenis arev ha'isur v'eino nikar la'ayin. Again, it doesn't make a bit of a difference whether we activate rov and bittul or we don't activate it. But as long as there's a tarovis, the very reality of the tarovis, the ein ha'isur nikar la'ayin, shuv lo amrina bei kavuah. Umehai time lo shayach lomer kavuah legabe kol anoshim sheba'olam hoil vehein mu'uravim zu bezu. Aval das Ramban, right? The Ramban doesn't require nikar ha'isur b'mkomo to operate with kol kavuah. Rak bittul mafkia din kavuah. We need bittul. If we can't have and apply bittul, then the Ramban is of the opinion that we're going to apply kavuah. Memela holu b'nei adam eina b'telim mishum hachi lo azlina basaruba b'tarova shel b'nei adam. And if you can't apply the halacha of bittul b'rov, chashvin alei kemechzal ment. So again, just to summarize, whereas Tosfos' shita is that if it's not nikar b'mkomo, meaning there is a tarovis b'mitzius, the physical reality is that we can't determine where is the isur, then according to Tosfos, it's not kavuah. Kavuah by definition means there's the isur. I can point to it and I see it in front of my eyes. If I have a tarovis that's no nikar, there's no kavuah. And therefore I can apply the principle of rov. However, the Ramban holds that even if it's not nikar b'mkomo, I can still apply the principle of kavuah. The only force that undermines, that's mavatel kavuah, is bittul. It's bittul that comes to be mafkia kavuah. But if you don't have bittul, like in this case where an Adam, even in the Tarovas of Rov, is not Batel, then we apply the principle of Kavuah. And what kind of din of Kavuah is it, Rabbosai? It's no rice. And therefore, also l'chol nashim sheba'olam according to Ramban is no rice. Now, Rav Soloveitchik claims that this issue between Tosfos and the Ramban is in fact a machlokus between the Rashba and the Tur. I have problems with this, but I do want to go through the Rashba and the Tur and see what we can come up.
What would be the application? It doesn't exist in this case, but what would be the application? But in this case, would you be like you're saying like you can point to the possible source of this.
Right. Let's say, for example, I have a bunch of behemoths, and I know that one is a treifa. Or, for example, the Sugya Zbachim. I have a number of basar kachim, and I don't know. I can't even point to one single Vadai Isa. There's not one butcher shop that I could say, right? So, for example, if you're going to have a case where we know that a treifa got mixed up into a store, that's not going to be Kavuah according to Tosfos. Why? Even if that piece of meat is a chaticha real is kabed and it's not batel, according to Tosfos, I still would not apply Kavuah, and then I have a right to go back to my original premise and operate with roe. And I'm going to say that this came from the roe. Why? Because I don't know where the treifa is. But if I know that there's a treifa in this butcher shop, that's a whole different story. Then it's Kavuah. So if I don't know if I went into, and the same thing is going to apply, for example, in the case of right, in the case of the Isha, right, we can't point that figure and say, well, this woman is certainly the sister of your wife. There's no woman on the face of the earth that we can identify. So according to Tosfos, the precondition for applying Kavuah is going to be identification. I can identify with all certainty where the Yisr is. Now, I have a suffix whether or not I took from the Yisr or I didn't take from the Yisr. Now, there are a whole bunch of Rishonim who argue that when there's no Kavuah d'oraisa, according to Tosfos, nevertheless, there's Kavuah d'rabbanan. So before we get to the Rashba and the Tur, I'd like to ask the following question. What does it mean to talk about Kavuah d'rabbanan? I'm a man of statistics. What are the statistical probabilities that this came from the Miyut? The Miyut might be 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000. So the Rabbanan are going to come and impose a halacha of Kavuah when the Torah did not. The Torah said it's called the Parsh Meruba Parsh, always. Even if the suffix was no letter Makom Kvias, if there was no Nikara Isser, according to Tosfos. So why did the Rabbanan, understand, I'm asking almost a philosophical question. What motivated the Rabbanan to make this Isser Kavuah? And again, the Rashba has his explanation, but I want to ask the obvious question. We're all asking this question. Kavuah is not logical. There's no logic to Kavuah. It defies, all of statistic probability. So now we're going to, if you talk about a Doraisa, it's Xeris HaKos, so I don't have to understand it. But you talk about a Drabanan, it should have some logic to it. So it occurred to me, and this is for, you're the jury, to suggest the following, that what are the chances that he bought meat for his dog? What are the chances that he bought meat for his family? So if he has a very hungry dog, and he has to feed his dog on a regular basis, what kind of suffix does he have? There are 9 kosher butcher shops. Can you tell me that the statistical probability is impacted by the number 9? It's 50-50. It's really mechza mechza. So what the Rabbanan were doing here, I think they were throwing in a svara into this. Again, it becomes very complicated when you talk about an achbar going into a house, I don't know if the Achbar gravitates towards a house that's Baduk or ain't a Baduk. I don't know. There maybe it's statistical, but maybe the Achbar sees in front of it two categories of Batir. Not on a metaphysical level. I'm saying on a legal level, whenever you have a Kavuah situation, even if it's not Kavuah d'oraisa, but you have to agree that by definition you have two categories, right? You've got an erva and not an erva. You have a kosher butcher shop and a non-kosher butcher shop. And so forth and so on. So by definition, mechza means that the suffix lends itself or is generated by two different categories. And how many members there are of that category is totally irrelevant. Now, I'm not going to tell you that that always works. I'm not saying that. But I'm arguing that perhaps in many, many situations that logic could work, and therefore that could have compelled the Rabbanon to come up with this entity called Kemechzal Mechzadomi when the Torah doesn't recognize it as Kemechzal Mechzadomi. Okay. Now let's see if we can understand the machlokes here. How am I doing on the clock? Am I okay, Rabbi? Yeah, I'm good. Okay. Okay, now this is going to be a feat. I'm going to try to see if I can do this. Somebody want to donate a second stender? I need two stenders. Okay. So let's open up for a moment to Kuf Yud Seif Hey, which I don't know if you have a Shulchan Aruch or you don't. So if you don't, it'll be Torah Shebal Peh.
We're in.
So we're in Kuf Yud, Yeridei Chel Daled,
Yeridei,
110, and we're in Sif Hey.
Yeridei, right?
Yeridei. That's what we'll learn. Not Hilchos Nida, but Yeridei.
Yeah.
Misha Lokach Basar Me'amakolin. And if you take a look in the Baragola, he points out that this is based on the Rashba, as many of the Seifim in the Shulchan Aruch in Yeridei Chelik Alpha based on the Rashba. Ve'afilu chaticha realis kabed, v'nimtzeis treifa b'makulin. Now here's the interesting case. At the time that he bought the meat, he didn't know that there was any treifa in the makulin. He had every right to assume there wasn't any treifa in the makulin. V'lo nodu, when did he find out about this? Lo nodu chatichos hatreifa. He finds out about the treifa. Let's say the treifa was in butcher shop number 1. He didn't pay any attention, and he doesn't recall which one of the butcher shops he went into. The problematic butcher shop is that one, number 1. Says the Rashba, right? We have a tremendous rove to rely on. That rove of the meat is kosher meat. And at what point in time was the suffix chal? After he had already taken the meat home and he was about to eat supper, right? Okay, so this is going to be another sugya, a famous Ran called Ein Kavuah Mafreh, right? That Ein L'Chabos Mishas Chidusho, and therefore Kavuah only operates Mikan Ulahabo. But maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that. But that's not really what I want to focus on. Okay, so he says Shalom Nafal Kevan Shalom. Lo Nafal Safek B'Kavuah El Yachar Shepiresh V'Rov Kosher Mut. Avo Likach Mikan V'Elech Asu. Now he wants to take or purchase more meat. At this point, he already knows that there's treifa meat in one of the butcher shops, correct? So now he has a situation of kavuah. He says also. Now, what does that mean also? He says, Afilu chaticha she'ena realis kabin. Now, without getting into all the nitty-gritty details, because I want to move at a certain pace, the Rashba gives the following explanation. After all, you have a chaticha she'ena realis kabin, so therefore it should be batel b'rov. And he says, Eina kol b'kiyim bazeh. V'yitu bein realis kabin l'she'ena ru. Okay, so he's claiming, and the Torah is going to reject this, that there's a mistake that could be very common. He doesn't know to distinguish between realis kabin and realis kabin. And we'll see that the Torah says that this kind of toes, that you don't know which chaticha should be batel and which should not be batel, he says the following. It's a makom d'shchichi rabim and lo chayshina l'tos. Okay, then, so we're going to just accept the Torah at face value, saying it's, there are plenty of people who can set the record straight. But the Rashba is assuming that the reason why we're going to prohibit the chaticha she'en realis kabin is because of this toes. Says the Torah, I don't get it. The basar is asur midin kavuah. After all, now he knows that there is treifa in one of the makolin, and if he doesn't know which makolin he's going to go into, then the suffix is nolad in a makom kavuah. Why does the Rashba have to tell me this whole story that, okay, a chaticha she'ena realis kabin, which technically should be batel, is not batel because of this toast that we're afraid. What about kavuah? So that the Torah comes to the exact same conclusion as the Rashba for a totally different reason. The Rashba is arguing some sort of chashash d'Rabbanan, and the Torah counters with a doraisa halach of kavuah. So on this we have a taz, a very, very long and complicated taz. I don't wish it on you right now, but you've probably done it already. But the taz is in Sif Katan Hey. It's entirely long taz. He says the following. Again, I'm not going to read the whole thing. First, he starts with the Rashba, who says that be'ena realis kabin shaper batel b'rov, but we're afraid of a toes. He quotes a Beis Yosef, Darkei Moshe. They all raise questions, each with his own nusach, and then he quotes. Then the Taz quotes the Torah. And he quotes all the marshals and so forth that disagree with the Torah. And then he says, Lanias daiti nira the divrei Rabbeinu atur nechonin. He wants to defend the Torah. He says, I'm skipping a little bit, he says, Kan, the nimtzeis behema achas treifa b'makulin. So there's definitely treif meat in one of the makolin. V'lo noda ezehi. So we don't know which makolin is. He says, Nimtza, af kishetatir chaticha she'ena realis kabin mitzad bitul b'rov, mikol makom, hachatichos hara'uyos asurim adayin. He says the following, let's take this piece of meat that's treif and cut it into pieces. And some of these pieces of meat are ru'uyos l'kabed and some are not. Says the Taz, you cannot apply the principle of bittul to the chatichos that are eina ru'uyos l'kabed. Why not? Both sides, help me out here. Why is it impossible? I'm just asking you to guess what the Taz is going to say. Maybe you saw the Taz already, and if you didn't, you could guess. Why is it impossible to say that this piece of meat will be batel in the tarovis because it's eina ru'uyos kabed, and this piece of meat is going to be awesome because it's real iskab. Hello, anybody home? Well, where did the meat come from, Rabbi? It came from a behemoth treifa. So we don't know if it came from behemoth treifa. We don't know if it's batel, but how can you say about one piece of meat that it's batel and about the other piece of meat that it's not batel? And this taz will give rise to a tremendous machlokes about what's called the famous Maisa Bevilna. Because the Taz is establishing a principle that you cannot apply the halach in a way that's impossible. If it leads you into a tarti de sasre, minei ube, and you can't be consistent, then you can't be matir, and therefore kol hachatichos asuros. Why are kol chatichos asuros? Because even the chaticha she'ena ruyalis kavit is not subject to bittul because of the chaticha ruyalis kavit. Once the chaticha she'ena ruyalis kavit is not batel, then what do we have? Kol kavuah kemeftal meftal. So therefore, the Taz defends the Torah for applying the principle of kavuah. And although, again, all those who rise up against the Torah will say, well, what about a chaticha she'en ruyalis kavi? Why can't it be batel? And the Taz is going to say you can't apply bittul here because you already asked the chaticha ruyalis kavi, and they came from the same behemoth. And therefore, if you can't apply bittul, memela we apply kavuah. So on this we have a Maisa Bevilna. Now, I would like to read to you the Maisa Bevilna, but I don't have it. I have the old time Shulchan Aruchs, and the Pri Chadash has this Maisa Bevilna at the very end, like as an addendum to Yoredei Chelik Aleph. But in any event, if you have any of the following Sfarim at access to, they all bring down the Maisa Bevilna, which we'll go over. There's the Beis Hillel in Siman Kuf Yud. There's the Pri Chadash again, as I said, in the Kunshus HaAchron. And what I do have in front of me somewhere is the Shev Shmaita. Where's my copy of the Shev Shmaita? In the bag? Oh, it's in the stender? Oh, it's here somewhere, that I know, because I know I brought it. Where did I put it?
Under the Shulchan Aruch?
Maybe it's under the Shulchan. That could be. Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Under the Shulchan. If I had a second stand. Okay. So I'm reading now. If you can, maybe you can get this up on HebrewBooks.org or Bar Ilan, whatever you like. And we're talking about Shmaita Dalid. Shmaita Dalid, Perek Gimel. Kosu b'tshuva sagaone basroi she'elo me'agon moram b'kilas kedosha vilna lagon morenu heshel echad sheshochat shiva behemos v'achar kach nimtza v'achas treifa, meaning nikev beis hakosos v'nis arvu at treifas b'ksheros. The kodem shenolad hasafek. So again, if there's already a latest hasafek, then you know that one of these 7 behemoths is a treifa. Then when you go in and you buy it, that's called kol kavuah. But what happened? We don't know where the treifa is amongst these 7 animals, and kodem shenolad hasafek, meaning kodem shenoda, nimkar chetzia shel behema achas. Half of an animal was sold. But Cheskes Kashrus. I mean, he didn't even know that there was a shiloh of trade. Me nema, the gam chetzi hasheni, the other half of this behema, mutter. Me achar de chetzi shenim kam mutter. You've already paskin on the half that you sold that it's mutter. Why? Because called the parish miruba parish, right? 6 out of 7 of the behemoths are kosher. and there was no Kavuah because the suffix was only nolad after it was Poresh, is Kevan Shanu Yodim Bevadai Shezeh Chetzi Hasheni. We know that this is the other half of that behema. Im Kain Ech Mechalik Behema Achas Lomar Shechetzi Muteres V'Chetzi Asura. Okay, now the Pri Chodesh quotes this Maisa Shahaya Bevilna, and I'm just going to summarize for you the names of the poskim if it interests anyone. They line up on two sides of the fence until the Pri Chodesh comes along. So, for example, you have the Beis Hillel and the Birchas HaZevach. They say that everything is awesome. In other words, now that you found out, after you applied Kol Deparch, that there's a half of an animal that's Kavuah, half of the same animal, then even the half that you took Becheskes Kashrus applying Kol Deparch now becomes awesome. On the other side of the fence, we have Rav Herschel himself and the Chelkas Mechokek, and they say everything is mutter. So the Pri Chodesh claims that all the Achronim, all the poskim were moved by the Taz. And the Shoresh, says the Pri Chodesh, of this whole diun, of this Nidon, was based on the Taz, who says that you cannot issue a psak that has within it a stira. And you have two choices in front of you. Either you say everything's asur, or you say everything's mutter. But you can't say that half the animal is mutter and half the animal is asur. Because if you're telling me you can eat half the animal, you're telling me it's not treifa. And vice versa. And if you go back here to the Shev Shmaitata, quoting the Pri Chodesh, because I don't have the Pri Chodesh in front of me, he says, Keven sha'anu yodim bevadai shezeh chetzi hasheni im kein ech nechalik behema achas lomar chetzi muteres v'chetzi asura. Because of Allah, now listen to this language. This is the Pri Chodesh. When the Pri Chodesh lived, about 2.5 centuries ago, what was his name? Chizkiyo, what was his name? Anyway, so because of Allah, v'anochi aroeh sheshum echad mehem lo kivein la'alacha yafa. Whoa, heavy language. Shekol zeh holich al ta'uso shekosav hataz. He says they all base themselves on the Taz, and the Taz made a Taz. Well, that's heavy. You know, if I was the Shach arguing against the Taz, that's one thing. Shekeves echad, meaning one animal, eino bedin shia miksaso mutu miksaso os. I want to make one comment before we go on. In Yiddish we call it a tzushtel, the hashva'ah here, the analogy, the premise here of the Pri Chodesh, that all these achronim and poskim were based on the Taz. I'm not 100% sure, because the Taz is not talking exactly about the same thing. You know, the Taz wants to know if I can apply bittul in this way and bittul in that way with the chaticha riyus kabed and chaticha she'ena riyus kabed. Okay, those are halachas of bittul. But here we're talking about something totally different. What we're talking about now, in this case of the Maisa Bevilna, is an animal which may be treifa, maybe not treifa. And I think that even if you reject the Taz in terms of Hilchas Bittul, but when you have a suffix where the animal is treifa or not, I believe that Kuliyamal Pligi, it's either all treif or it's all kosher. It's EF Shalachal. And therefore, based on this, the Pri Chodesh disagrees with everybody. And he says the following. He says that, trying to find the language here, he says This is a tos gamur, and kenamin pashud, that we can be matir half of the keves and not the other half. And he writes that masha nishar bechanus shadayin lo piresh, then we'll apply kavuah, that which was piresh, and we can apply kol parish, remains mutamidin ro. Bechol shiurei chachamim kachu, and that's how shiurei chachamim operate. Bechol misheino morekein lo yada beiser vehete ben yamino lismolach. Whoa. Now the Shev Shmaitita is going to analyze this Pri Chadash, and he has two chapters. He's got chapter 3 in Shmaita Dalet and chapter 4. And in chapter 3, he is going to defend the Pri Chadash, that we can split the animal into half, into two parts. And then he changes his mind. Just 1 second. I'm sorry. I just want to clear my head for a second. Oh. So the the Shev Shmaitita says the following. While it's true that we do find that chazakas on one can impact on another, we'll explain what that means in a second. And the Pri Chodesh wants to make a complete separation. He wants to cut between the rove on the chaticha that he brought, that he purchased originally, and the other. He says, you know what? I'm going to prove to you that we don't make that split. That if there's a chazaka on A, that chazaka will impact on B. And he quotes the Gemara in Ksubis with the Sugya that we started with earlier today. And the Gemara has a principle called Cheskas Ha'em Mahani Labas. Let me just backtrack for 1 minute, and I'm coming towards the end of the shir. He says the following. The Gemara at the beginning of Nida, right? A man jumps into a mikvah. He has a cheskas tameh, and the mikvah has a cheskas moleh. And then they check the mikvah, and they find out that it's chaser. So the Gemara goes like this. Mi'ikar adin, I don't mean mi'ikar adin, I mean to say initially in our logic, we would say that we didn't know that the mikvah was chaser when he went in, and therefore, based on the cheskas kashrus of the mikvah, we could be mitayr him. The Gemara at the end of the day rejects that because of what's called tarti l'reusa. What is tarti l'reusa? In addition to the fact that today we find the mikvah to be chaser, which is called hareshal cholafanecha, or cheskas ashta, we also have the chazaka of the person before he went into the mikvah, and he has a cheskas tum. Says the Shev Shmaitita, but if not for the principle of tarti l'reusa, the chazaka on the mikvah would have impacted on the gavra, on the person who was tummy and went into the mikvah, and we would have been mitayr him. And the Shev Shmaitita sees in this sugya a rejection of the Pri Chadash. Why? The Pri Chadash wants to say split. You know, we have one din of, let's say, rov on half the animal, and we have another din of kavuah on the other half of the animal, correct? No, says the Shef Shmaita, I'm going to prove to you that the rove on one half of the animal is going to impact on the other half of the animal. And we see this from the case of the Cheskas Mikvah, that the Cheskas Mikvah is going to impact on the person who went into the Mikvah. Does everybody like that? No, nobody likes that. I'll tell you why. There's an obvious hole in the logic of the Shef Shmaita. The reason why the Cheskas Mikvah impacts on the Gavra is because he went into the mikvah. And the question is whether he's Tomei or Tar depends upon the status of the mikvah. And if based on Chazaka, we determine that the mikvah is mole, it's kosher, then in Mela he's Tar. But to split an animal and say half of it is treif and half is not treif, that doesn't make any sense. But the Shef Shmaita claims that there's another sugya which is called Cheskas Ha'em Mahani Labas. And he says the following. Let me see if I can find this. He says, Perik Dalet, Omnam Achra Iyun, Roa Ani Es Divrei Amatirim Akol. Just 1 second. Let me just get my cheshboni. I want to end the shia soon, but just get the music. I didn't finish up. So here, in the case of a split piece of meat, argues the Shef Shmaita in favor of the prach. That's Per Gimel in the Shef Shmaita. He defends the prach by saying the following: although in the mikveh case, the mikveh will determine the tomb of the gavra. So that chazaka will impact on the person who went into the mikveh. But here he says, every part of the animal stands on its own and has its own suffix. Part of the animal doesn't have an impact on the other half of the animal. So when I ask about one half of the animal, whether it's treif or kosher, I'm not asking, well, what about the other half of the animal? I'm asking on this half of the animal, this piece of muscle.
Yeah, meaning if let's say you had all 7 animals were split in half, those 7 halves of each animal were then parched, right? So in that case, you look at those parched sides and you say, oh, well, each animal is parched. But then you look back at the.
Wait, is there a rove? You lost me. If you split all 7, you don't have a rove. What do you say it again? I'm sorry.
Meaning each of the 7. Maybe I got something wrong over here, but
No, because if each of the 7 are split, then you don't have a rove. You made the whole sugi because. What are you saying? There's one treifa and the rest are kosher. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah.
There's one treifa.
Yeah, I thought you were saying all 7 were treifa.
Yeah, one treifa amongst the 7. And then each of those 7 are cut in half and half of it's shipped out. So I look at each of those.
Shipped out before the Nola Suffix? Before the Nola Suffix.
That's the case. I look at each of those 7 pieces and I say parch, right? Both parch, but parch. So
on those halves, so those 7 halves.
Then I look back at the 7 that are still in the store and I'd say, wait a second, there must be where did the treifa go? Meaning, if you're assuming that there's a connection between each of the halves to its original point, then the treifa just disappeared.
I'm not sure if I understand what you mean by disappeared. I would say that with regard to the other 7 halves, we're going to apply the principle of Kavuah, and that's kemechza al mechza. So anytime you want to eat half of the 7 that remain, the 7 halves that remain, you're going to say I have a suffix. I don't know whether it's treif or not treif. I'm not sure if I'm understanding you correctly. I'm just a little pressed for time because I want to end the shir. I think I went over time already. So where are we holding now? So again, what we're doing here in the Shef Shmaita of Perek Gimel is we're defending the position of the prach, of the Pri Chadash, that we can split between half and say rove on half and kavuah on the other half. And that's because the way the halach operates is that you could say rove and apply rove, and then. But if, let's say, the suffix on one half would be generated by the other half, that's the case of mikvah, and therefore the mikvah would now impact on the person. Okay, now we get to Perek Dalet. In Perek Dalet, the Shef Shmaita comes to the conclusion that everything is mutter, both halves, even the half that is kavuah. And how does he see this? He's going to come up with a case, excuse me, where the two halves are not one causing the other. It's not that one is the root cause of the other. And yet, the chazak on one is going to permit the other. What's the case? So the Sugya and Ksubis on Daf Yud Gimel, Ra'ua Midaberes, and the Gemara applies the principle of Cheskas Ha'em Mahani Labas. What does that mean? We don't know whether the mother, and therefore the child who was born from this mother, the Bas, was Nivala Lepasula. If she was Nivala Lepasula, and therefore through that Bia she became a Zona, then her daughter is also Pasula Kahuna. She's a Halola. And the Gemara says, and that's how the Rambam paskins in Perek Tesvav Halach Yud Aleph of Hilchos Ishus, he says, Cheskas Ha'em, that's the Gemara's language, Mahani Labas. What does that mean? Think about it for a minute. The mother had a Cheskas Kashrus. The Bas never had a Cheskas Kashrus. From the minute she was born, we had a suffix whether she was a Ksheira or a Psula. And yet the Gemara applies the Chazak of the mother onto the daughter. Now, each one, the mother and the daughter, has her own independent suffix as to whether or not she's Ksheira L'Kahuna. And yet, the Gemara is willing to say that the Chazak of the mother works for the daughter. Why? Because it's impossible that the mother would be Ksheira and the daughter would be Psula. Because what generates the Psula of the daughter? It would be a Bias Nus to the mother. Do you follow what I mean? A Bias Poseles. So that we have a situation where logically they're interdependent, Haba Talia, you can't split, and we're going to paskin Lakula and be matir Lakuna based on one chazaka, even though each one, the mother and the daughter, are a separate entity. And therefore, he says the same identical situation exists in the Maisa Vivilna. Why? Because even though each half of the Chaticha has its own independent suffix, nevertheless, we can apply the rove of one to be matir the other. The rove of one half to be matir the other. On this Shev Shmaitita, there is a tremendous literature, which I just want to mention to you as I end, in what's called the Kovet Shiurim. Anybody know who wrote the Kovet Shiurim? I don't know if he wrote it or his Talmidim wrote it. Rebbe Chanan in Ksubis on Daf Yud Gimel. And it's a fascinating Rebbe Chanan because he quotes Reb Chaim and he takes you back to the whole suffix that we started with. How does Kavuah work? Does Kavuah work on its own, or Kavuah is just going to block the rove, and as soon as we can remove Kavuah, we go back to the rove? So this is a fascinating Chakir. So what I didn't get up to today was the run about Kavuah Mafreya, which I was hoping to talk about, but I think I can. Let me take this opportunity to thank you very much for joining me, to Rabbi Zimmerman for inviting me. And I hope you got something out of the shir. I mean, again, this is just like, I don't even know if we scratched the tip of the iceberg, but at least it's good to review and get some ideas. Even the issues in the poskim. If we had more time, I would ask you to go through the tour on Kuf Yud Hey, meaning on the Rajba, and then go to the Taz and plow through the Taz. And then finally the Pri Chodesh. If you want to go beyond that, the Shev Shmaita. You want to go beyond that, the Kovet Shiur. I want to wish you all a great deal of Hatzlacha and hope.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so
Is there a Mari for next week?
Thank you.
A version. Is there going to